On slide 23, we've come to the last bullet of the talk. We're going to go through the Mplus scripts for the both the classic and the new model for the Wheaton et al. Data. First, the classic model. We're going to remind ourselves of the fact that we're going to try a metric invariance model here, equality of loadings across time, and we're going to allow for correlated residuals for each item for adjacent time points. So A1 with A2, A2 with A3, and same thing for the P, the powerless indicator. So let's go to the Mplus output. And I'm showing it in the HTML output version, which is easy to skip around in. So we have the data is a table using table 2 from the 1977 chapter for 3 time points. So we give the correlations, means, and standard deviations from which Mplus computes the sample means and computes the sample covariance matrix and includes the means. 932 observations. And the model is quite straightforward. We measure the SES factor by 2 indicators, and then we measure the 3 time-specific factors of alienation by their 2 indicators, anomia and powerlessness. And we're going to deviate from the default of fixing the first loading to 1, so I have an asterisk here for the first indicator for each factor. So I have 2 free factor loadings, and I label those parameters parameter 1 and parameter 2, and they're held equal across time by this setup. And I'll choose to set the metric by fixing this variance to 1. It's actually the residual variance, but by fixing the first time point variance, you have handled the metric for all 3 time points by the fact that you have equality of loadings. So the model is identified that way. We regress F1 on SES, F2 on F1 and SES, and F3 on F2 on SES. So a lag 1 type of model. And then we allow for the residual correlations, 66 with 67, 67 with 71. First for anomia and then for powerlessness. And we're asking for Tech1 mod indices and standardized. So we go to model fit information and we see 31 parameters and this likelihood that we had in the summary table of fit, with a chi-square that is a little bit too high and RMSEA that's also a little bit too high. Now the model results show a significant loading for SEI as measuring SES, and the loadings for F1, F2 and F3 are held equal across time as we see, and they are both significantly different from 0. And then you have F1 regressed on SES, which is negative significant as expected. As SES increases, the F factor, alienation, goes down. F2 and F1 is positive and significant, and F2 on SES is negative significant. Same for F3 on F2 and F3 on SES. And then we have the residual correlations here, or covariances rather. Pairwise, these are significant for anomia. For powerlessness, the first residual covariance is not significant, but the second one is. We don't bother with the intercepts here. We're not trying a growth model. We just ignore them. And you get the variance of the SES factor. We'll just check that it's not 0 or negative. And all of these residual variances are also positive and healthy. And then you have the factors here, F1, F2, and F3, their residual variances, where the first one was fixed to set the metric. Now you can look at the standardized solution as well, and get all of the results in standardized metric. And for instance, then you can see what the correlations between the residuals are: 0.3, 0.2, 0.1, 0.1. So higher residual correlation for anomia than for powerlessness. And we have another kind of standardization, and then finally we get to, I can go this way faster, modification indices. So here we have a couple of interesting ones. Let's take a look at these first. For instance, here F3 on F1 has a fairly high modification index, the expected drop in chi-square if you free that. And that is then a lag 2 model. So F3 is not only influenced by F2 but by F1 as well. So that could help improve the model. And then if you look further down here, we have 54, a very high value. That's for anomia 71 with anomia 66. So that's a residual correlation between time point 1 and time point 3, which we didn't include. And I don't see that that is not very high for anomia, however. Oh, sorry, for powerlessness, it's not as high. So we could make these adjustments one at a time and see if it's needed or not. But we're not going to bother with that. Also, we could take a look at the R-square. R-square for anomia and powerlessness. Now, even though the loadings are equal across time, the reliabilities will not be, because the variances change over time. The total variance change over time too. So R-square is the same thing here as reliability. So the reliability of anomia and powerlessness are in the 0.7 range, and it goes down a little bit over time. All right, so that's the classic model. And then we turn to output number 2, which is for the new model on slide 25. We show it again, and just to remind you, it is a standard SEM model in the sense that it's single level. I've just drawn it in a way to emphasize that we have a between part that shows variation across individuals, and a within part that shows variation across time. So let's see how we set that up in Mplus. Let's look at the input instructions. So I put a couple of comments in here. I distinguish between the so-called between level and the so-called within level. Again, this is not a two-level analysis, it's a regular SEM. So on the between, that is in the left part of the picture, we have the SES factor measured by education and SEI as before. And then we define 2 random intercept factors. And they are anomia and power. Anomia measured by these 3 anomia items at the different time points with fixed loadings 1. These are the unit coefficients that I talked about earlier for random effects influencing the observed outcome. And same thing for power. That's the random intercept for the powerless indicator. And then I regress those 2 factors, those 2 random intercept on SCS as defined up here. And then I turn to the right part of the picture, the so-called within level, where I have the same loading metric invariance as before, setting the metric the same way and having the same regressions. And to make sure that I don't correlate between factors with the within factors, I have this statement. So SES-power is the SCS, anomia, and power factors, and that all 3 of them are uncorrelated with the time-specific factors F1 to F3. So no correlation across between and within, so to speak. And then I have the invariant residual variances here. The 2 residual variances for each time point are equal across time. I could also somehow try to hold the factor variances equal across time. I don't do that here. I don't think it's entirely necessary, and we are going to skip that. So let's take a look at that model fit information then. We find the 25 parameters that we talked about in the summary. That is 6 parameters less than the classic model, with a good chi-square and a good RMSEA. And the model results, we have the intercept factors defined here. We see the characteristic ones. And then we have the 3 time-specific factors, which are, again, the factor loadings are significant, both of them. And the random intercepts regressed on the SCS, negative, significant in both cases and of the same magnitude. So that's saying that as SCS increases, your anomia and powerlessness random intercepts go down. F2 and F1 significant, positive, but here something new. F3 on F2 negative but not significant. So insignificant, which it wasn't. It was positive significant in the classic analysis. And the rest is of less interest. And then you can also take a look at the standardized model results and the R-squares, and you can compare those values across the classic and new and think about the differences in interpretations. I'm going to turn to model modification indices, and here's all we have. 1, namely, and only 14 as compared to earlier. I think we had something in the 50s. And this is between anomia in 71 and powerlessness in 66. So the last and the first time point and different indicators doesn't make much sense, perhaps. So we ignore that quite simply. Let's ignore that. All right, so that shows the new way of analyzing the Wheaton et al. Data.